There you go. Yeah, so because this is being recorded, if folks who are watching this later and have thoughts and any input that they want to give, we really welcome that feedback. And you can, I believe the email is on the team page. Is that correct, Serena? Mm-hmm.
Yep, it should be.
Great. Yeah, so we would welcome feedback and further discussion. Yeah, so this is our first kind of group discussion meeting of the year and kicking us off. But before we get into that, I'm going to hand it over to Serena for some housekeeping.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And I think I recognize everybody, and I think you're all at this point really familiar with how Zoom works and have been at your fair share of IARPC meetings. So I'll try and just keep this really quick. And feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as I do this. I imagine a lot of you know each other, but always fun to hear about what the weather's doing or something bizarre that happened to you today. So this meeting is come as you are. We recognize that joining virtual meetings these days is a lot. So thank you all for coming and making the time and space to be here today. If you've got pets, partners, children, or anything else going on in the background, don't worry about it. Just keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking, so we don't get too much background noise. Great if you can turn on your cameras when you're speaking, but if that doesn't work for you, that's completely understandable. I think you were muted when you came in, but you can just unmute yourself if you want to speak. And if you're on the phone, you can unmute yourself by clicking *6. And again, I think people are familiar with this, but you can use the chat at any time to make questions or comments. And I think that's the next slide, Christina, if you don't mind jumping forward. So to chat, select the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and select the option to chat everyone in order to ask a question or make a comment. You can also use the raise hand button if it's something you'd rather express verbally, and we can call on you. And I think you can raise your hand if you're on the phone by dialing *9. And jumping over to the next slide, as you're aware now, the meeting is being recorded. We're going to post this recording on the event page and our YouTube channel later this week. And if there is any kind of Zoom bombing or anything like that happens, we'll lock the meeting room. And if you have any technical difficulties, just shoot me a message and I'll do my best to help you out. And then finally, IARPC Collaborations is a community space. Our code of conduct aims to support a community where all people feel open and safe to participate, introduce new ideas, and inspire others. So if you haven't already read our code of conduct, I will put a link in the chat in just a moment. We expect everyone to adhere to the principles for conducting research in the Arctic, appreciate and accommodate our similarities and differences, be inclusive, commit to self-improvement, give professional feedback, recognize the colonial history of science and research, and respect intellectual property and Indigenous data sovereignty. Derogatory language, personal attacks, unacceptable or unlawful use of intellectual property, unwelcome sexual attention or violence or threats of violence will not be tolerated in our space. And if you need to report a code of conduct violation, there are instructions in this link that I am putting in the chat. All right. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary and ancestral home to many different Indigenous peoples. And we recognize that these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples. Wherever you are joining this meeting from, IARPC honors and recognizes the place-based knowledge of Indigenous peoples and their ancestral and contemporary stewardship of their homelands. I welcome all of you to do the same. It's the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain a better understanding of the Indigenous peoples and cultures with which we engage. So for example, I'm based in Boulder, Colorado, and I acknowledge the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne people whose traditional lands I reside in. So back over to you, Christina.
Yeah, thanks, Serena. Okay. So just briefly, looking at the agenda, we're going to do a roll call. We have a pretty small group, so we might just go around the room here. And then I'm going to give a brief overview of our community of practice and the goals of this meeting. We're then going to kind of switch the normal order of things that we do in IARPC and have our updates round robin at the beginning. And then I'm going to briefly go over our deliverables and plans for 2023. And this is the point where we would really welcome some feedback on what our plans are and how we can better foster a inclusive and vibrant community of practice here. Okay, so we're just going to go around the room, and I think we can do this popcorn style. So just when you're done introducing yourself, call on the next person. So hi, everyone. I'm Christina Boncel. I'm one of the co-leads of this team. I am a marine ecologist at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management based here in Anchorage, and I'll pass it over to Tom.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Ravens. I'm a professor of civil engineering and coastal engineering here at the University of Alaska Anchorage. So co-lead.
And I guess we'll pass it over to Liz Walsh.
Hi, all. I think that's working now. My name's Liz Walsh. I am a sociocultural anthropologist at the University of Cambridge over in the UK. It's 8 p.m. right now. So I hope you're all having a good start to your days. But I'm also a co-lead of this community of practice. And I'll pass to Taze.
Hey everyone, Taze Jones with the National Park Service, and I am the final co-lead for the Coastal Resilience Community of Practice, and based here in Anchorage. And I will pass it on over to Danielle.
Thanks, Taze. I'm Danielle Dixon. I am a program manager for North Pacific Research Board based in Anchorage, Alaska. And I also serve as a non-federal co-lead for the Marine Ecosystems Community of Practice for IARPC. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Christina. Yeah, good morning. It's 11:12 here in Anchorage, Alaska. I work with Christina at BOEM, where I've been employed for almost 8 years now as a social scientist, both in the environmental assessment and environmental studies sections of our Office of Environment. Currently, I'm in the environmental sciences or studies section. And before that, I was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, also in Anchorage, Alaska, for 7 years. I held 2 positions over there as a social scientist, one in the Refuges Planning Department and a second in the Office of Subsistence Management, which administers the Federal Subsistence Program in Alaska. It's nice to see you all. Thank you.
Jackie?
Hi everyone, Jackie Overbeck. I'm with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. I'm our Alaska Region Geospatial Coordinator and based in Anchorage. This is the first IARPC meeting I've been to since joining with NOAA back in September. So I'm coming up to speed a little bit on the federal agency side of things. Previously, I was with the state of Alaska managing a coastal hazards program, working with communities on flood and erosion issues. So looking forward to seeing what's been going on in this space.
Yeah, thanks. Karen, I'm not sure.
Hi, yeah, my name's Kieran. I know it's a
Kieran.
little phonetically incorrect, so that's okay. But yeah, my name's Kieran. I'm from upstate New York. I'm an engineer by training, so I've done my degrees in biological and systems engineering. I'm currently working in the sustainability space and international development, focusing on climate issues. And I've just been really passionate about the Arctic and wanting to get more involved. So excited to meet you all and be here today.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Emily?
I'm with EPA's office development.
Emily, you're kind of breaking up.
I'm sorry about that. I'll put my intro in the chat. I'm on a bus right now. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you for joining from while in transit. Erin?
Hi, I'm Erin Trosham. I'm a research assistant professor at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at UIF. And I lead a project on the UIF side working with JABLTech, the Joint Airborne LiDAR Bathymetry Technical Center of Excellence at the Army Corps. And we collect, or they collect topobathy data, and then we assist processing, working with it, and disseminating the data.
Great, thank you. Okay, so thank you everyone for those intros. I'm gonna briefly go over our team and our goals of this team. So this community of practice, as we're now calling these IARPC groups, is about strengthening coastal community resilience and advancing stewardship of coastal natural and cultural resources by engaging in research related to the interconnections of people and the natural and built environments. And this group has been going on since the mid-2010s. And oh, there's the co-leads again. We've already introduced ourselves, but as a reminder. And we, over time, the team has really been focused on that interconnection between those different parts, right? So there's been this emphasis on co-production, on community engagement, and interdisciplinary research with lots of community-led discussions and sort of an open forum format for sharing perspectives and ideas. And, you know, we've had meetings on coastal erosion, on local research priorities in different parts of Alaska, on aspects of food security, climate adaptation planning. That's just an example of some of which I like combed through the IARPC meeting history of like over time, what has this team done? So this meeting is to try to foster that environment of collaboration and community driven discussions into the new year and under the new Biennial Implementation Plan. So for those who aren't familiar, IARPC has a 2-year implementation plan with various deliverables. I think Serena has a link for that in the chat if you want to refer to that. And so under that plan and those deliverables, the IARPC team leads have been meeting and talking and planning amongst ourselves, but we want this coastal resilience community of practice to retain some of that community-driven structure to try to enhance the impact of the work that we're doing. So this meeting is to try to kind of keep that going and brainstorm of how we can keep on doing that under this new structure. So in the spirit of collaboration and being community driven, I wanted to open it up to an updates round robin. So I know there's some new folks here, but even if you have been coming to this meeting for a while, it would be great to hear some updates on what you're working on. And then if there's particular areas or topics that you're interested in looking for collaboration or that you think could be enhanced by collaboration, we would love to hear that. So I'm just going to open up the floor and folks can raise their hand or they can chime in.
Well, I'll chime in, Christina.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
So I'm actually going to New Orleans next week. I got a request to come down there and give a presentation to a coastal sediments conference about Arctic storms. So I've been sort of putting on a presentation. So it's kind of a great thing to do. Think about how storms are in an Arctic setting are so different from storms in a non-Arctic setting. You know, so it's been a fun thing to do. Happy to share that at some point with folks up here.
So this is Jeff. Tom, did you work at all on that recent one that we had in Northwest Alaska? I think it was it Merbok?
Mhm.
I didn't work specifically on that storm. I've worked on storms in general in the Arctic and flooding and erosion due to storms, and have been sort of focused on how things are different up here, you know, with the importance of thermal processes as well as mechanical processes along the coast.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds interesting. I'm sure the hurricane people in New Orleans will be interested to compare and contrast the situation.
And Jackie, you just put in a link to a story map, so we'll be sure to capture that and put that in the notes. Do you want to speak on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're asking about, you know, Typhoon Merbok, and I guess it's worth mentioning that there was a pretty big interagency and collaborative effort to collect data after the storm and provide that out to the public. So I've been sharing that information out to a lot of different groups. One way of doing that is through the story map, just because we do have so many different inputs of who was collecting data and where to access that. It's all in one place in the story map. But just to show the post-storm aerial imagery that was collected as a part of that effort, and high water marks that were collected at individual communities and can be utilized to identify how high floodwaters reached and some other impacts. Do you think, Christina, it's worth mentioning in this forum, you know, some of the collaborations around mapping in general, as well as water level data collection?
Yeah, I think that would be great. We are going to talk specifically about the upcoming meeting that Tom is organizing in a little bit. But yeah, I think generally hearing about those activities would be great.
Okay, yeah, what meeting is that? Did I mix up the USGS meeting with this meeting?
Maybe.
It's possible. What meeting is coming up? What's the meeting that's coming up? Just so I don't.
Yep.
Go to.
Yeah, so we have a meeting in May where we're going to be, and I have a slide on this later, but we're going to be discussing, and Tom can say more about the particular deliverables relating to coastal mapping and coastal erosion.
Okay. Yeah, maybe it's worth going over some of this during that.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Danielle?
Hey, I just wanted to chime in to follow up on Tom's comment about the conference you're going to related to storms down in New Orleans. And from the perspective of the marine ecosystems community of practice, I want to urge keeping in mind that aside from the very important physical influences of storms on things like erosion and infrastructure, there are also some important potential implications for the biological system as well. And it might be worth taking the opportunity when you're communicating with folks down in the southern US to talk about the in the fact that in last year we had some observations of very high concentrations of harmful algal bloom, of cells that can cause harmful algal blooms, some of the highest reported anywhere in the world. And then that was followed by Typhoon Merbok, which potentially resuspended some of those cysts. And so that sort of thing can have some real implications on the biological ecosystem, as well as the communities that are living and subsisting in the region. And folks down in the southern US have quite a lot of experience working on things like harmful algal bloom forecasting and things. So I don't know whether that might come up in the context of your conference, but it's just something to keep in mind as far as relevance to folks up here. Thanks.
Thank you for bringing that up. Is there like, I was wondering, do you have like a flyer about harmful algal blooms in Arctic settings, or anything like that, a website?
That I think there have been some presentations for IARPC, I think, given around the subject, and we can put you in touch with folks. There's Don Anderson and his team at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution were leading the cruise that documented that event last summer. And the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network that can be found on the AU's Alaska Ocean Observing System website probably also has some good, sound bites about the information too.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Anyone else want to give an update or overview on things that they're working on?
Sure, Christina, I'll mention one procurement that I'm working on right now. As I said before, I'm part of the BOEM Alaska Office of Environment, and I'm in this environmental studies or sciences management section. And as a social scientist here at BOEM, both if I'm doing NEPA or studies, I tend to cover the recreation and tourism stuff as part of my area of expertise. And we are trying to put out a solicitation. I can't say a whole lot about it, but we're going to be hopefully doing some up-to-date baseline and new data collection in the Cook Inlet region for recreation and tourism, and how the current and potentially future fossil fuel development may be related to that, or how it may be affected by energy development. And it will be relevant for renewables as well. But that's one thing that I'm starting to work on with our contracting officers. We don't have a solicitation out, and it's a competitive contract, so I really can't say a lot about it. But we are looking into recreation and tourism, Cook Inlet, to update some of the data.
Thanks, Jeff.
Christina, I can, this is Taze. I can jump in. So the National Park Service, we have a couple things that are going on up in the Arctic, coastally related. One of them being an ongoing inventory and monitoring assessment program that is focused on a combination of fisheries, but really looking at lagoon communities and trying to understand some of the changes that are happening within the lagoons up in sort of the northern Seward Peninsula, and then also just north of Cape Krusenstern. That's an ongoing project that's done a handful of things, from really trying to understand food web, food dynamics, and it's very much so tied to some of the subsistence activities that are taking place in and around those lagoons. So that's one thing that we're doing. And then another thing is ongoing efforts to understand erosion and the potential impacts of erosion kind of broadly along that coast and the impacts that erosion may have to subsistence users as a whole. So those are kind of two big things that are happening that we have going on up in the Northwest Arctic on a regular basis.
Thanks, Taze.
So I should mention, Christina, too, NOAA, our Office for Coastal Management, we have some ongoing activities related to this. And one of those is a collaboration that was started in the last year with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium and standing up their climate initiatives program. So that project is ongoing and has a few different deliverables, one of which being, if you're familiar with the unmet needs report, as it's been under development for the last 3 years. So finalizing that, but also a few other tasks. Really strengthening that relationship between ANTHC and our office. I've been providing technical guidance for the communities that they assist on various flood and erosion projects that have been carried, like basically they'll have projects that the BIA has funded through tribal resilience. And then I'll take a look at those projects and provide them some assistance on that. Most recently, we developed a technical team that reviewed a flood study for Shishmaref and just finished that up recently. So it's one example of how we're doing that. And then the National Coastal Resilience Fund funding opportunity is open now. And there are a few projects that are coming online for Alaska in the last round to do with migration of certain facilities and communities and creating new neighborhoods for those. So yeah, those are just some broad updates, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. If you have any links related to those, feel free to throw them in the chat.
I'll go. I've just, in my own research, I went from being a PhD student to being a postdoc, I think since we had our last big meeting. So that's been a fun thing for me. But in addition to that, continued to work on labor flows in rural Alaska, specifically looking at relations between transient populations and then kind of permanent residents of those communities, how those relations are experienced. Also in my postdoctoral role, I'm affiliated with a small museum here in Cambridge, and so have been doing a lot of local outreach, but also have been thinking kind of broadly about how digital technologies can connect us in the UK to community members in Alaska, in Canada, and other parts of the circumpolar north, whose cultural patrimony we have. There's lots of objects, particularly objects that were gathered 100 years ago or more under questionable means that we'd like to, if not get back into people's hands, and I think that is the ideal in a lot of instances, at least make people aware of. And so we're looking at things like photogrammetry and other technologies to do some 3D imaging to maybe make those into digital assets and get conversations started, which is a little bit less directly coastal, but I think still has a relevance to some projects. So.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. That's really interesting. One of the earlier meetings that I was able to find info on was looking at coastal archaeology in the Arctic and about the loss of sites. So it seems related. Okay, pausing for other updates.
I was going to say I can give a quick update.
Yeah, go ahead, Erin.
So We are working on the, I would call it backlog of topography data that's been collected. So JabbleTech, so the topography data that JabbleTech has collected for 2018 and 2019 is available right now in Digital Coast and has been for quite some time. They did not collect data in 2020 due to COVID, and then they've collected data in 2021 and 2022. And so we are still processing the 2021 data right now. We have had some undergrad students working on it. I've got a staff member brought on to do some processing. And if there are priorities of areas that you would like processed sooner, if you want to send me an email and let me know, that would be really helpful. We do have a big list, and yeah, it just, some of the blocks are really noisy. They have a lot of sedimentation in it, and it takes our team a long time to clean them. And so that's something that I've definitely identified as a key thing that we need to figure out a better system for, because it's this, what we're doing right now is not, we need the data faster. That's what it comes down to. So anyways, so yeah, so anyway, so that's probably a big update. And so, and JabbleTech will be back up this summer with their plane, flying more sites. If you have a specific need, yeah, feel free to let me know, and I can pass that on to Jennifer Wozencraft. I know they're still doing some planning right now. Yeah, and I know that she's planning on, Jennifer's the National Coastal Marine Program Manager of JabbleTech. And so she's the main lead. I know she's planning on going to a bunch of the Merbok sites, and they have data before and afterwards. I know a lot of the data before, I think some of it has definitely not been processed. We're actually like that's a high priority for us right now. And then after the field collection, will also be a high priority to reprocess or take the data that's collected this summer and reprocess it. So anyways, yeah, the gist is we have a lot of data. It takes us a while to process. We're aware of that. We're trying to address that. But if you have priorities, definitely let me know. And that actually helps us sift through and prioritize our workflow internally with Woodford. So
Thanks, Erin. Could you put your contact info in the chat so we have it down? And then Tom has a look on his face like he wants to ask
Yeah.
you.
Also,
your comments, Erin, sort of prodded some questions that I have in my mind about like historic LiDAR data that was collected, like for example, on the YK Delta, and it was collected at a time when there wasn't really good, reference stations because the GPS network wasn't so good. And so I'm wondering if the community is, with there's an effort now to install a lot more core stations, which should basically improve GPS data collection generally in Western and Northern Alaska. And so I'm wondering what the community's plan is with the old LiDAR data. Will it be upgraded to accommodate the new core stations, or is that not really what people are planning?
So if you're talking about LiDAR that's like not topography LiDAR, so just like the regular LiDAR, I'm not aware of that as much. I know even in the Typhoon Merbok areas that the USGS is planning on going back and reflying just regular LiDAR data over a bunch of those sites. And then we'll be doing topography LiDAR as well. And so I've brought it up. Personally, the topography data is like, because it goes under the water, but we are getting the near shoreline as well. That can be like, in a lot of ways, it's probably the most valuable actually. And then when we're flying that imagery, we're also collecting RGB near IR imagery. And then also there's a hyperspectral sensor on there as well. That data hasn't been publicly released. That's something that we're actually working on. So yeah, so in terms of like coordinating terrestrial LiDAR and topography LiDAR, they're yeah, like I said, I've asked Jennifer about that, and there's there's not really a clear path forward, is what I would say. But yeah, the USGS is continuing to collect terrestrial LiDAR actually, so it could be repeated.
So yeah, I think this is a good conversation for our other collaborative groups that we have on mapping within the Alaska Geospatial Council and the Alaska Mapping Executive Committee, because that's where the plans are being made for the USGS disaster supplemental LiDAR. And there has been an ongoing conversation in regard to, topobathy versus terrestrial, where with the terrestrial LiDAR, they can fly so much higher and go so much further inland that, you need that coverage, especially on the YK Delta, where it's very flat, very far inland, and the mapping needs to extend pretty far. But the topobathy LiDAR does get underneath the water in some cases. And so, Aaron, I'm wondering whether we should have a conversation where those are used jointly together to maximize the amount of coverage, where we get as far inland as is necessary, but also potentially some underwater. And I have priorities, but if you're continuing to take community priorities on both historical data, that would be great. I do have a meeting with John this afternoon in regard to upcoming priorities, so hopefully can translate those down to you all as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, it's I think it's important to clarify the it's important to clarify the purpose of it. So I know right now with the topobathy data, most of the topobathy data focused on Merbok isn't baseline data, it's now repeat data actually. So so that's a little bit different. And seeing if that major storm did have erosion, which I think that'll be interesting. But yeah, no, I agree. I think a little bit more separation and clarification of the technologies and the areas and why there's the overlap would be really helpful. And then also I think it helps set priorities as well between the two groups.
Yeah, and Tom, you had asked a question about historical LiDAR data sets and whether or not those are getting updated with new control. I would say it's very challenging to reprocess LiDAR data sets. I don't know of any plans to do that, but the key thing to consider is your datum transformations as you're going from those older data sets to your newer data sets. There's a variety of those that NGS makes available, and we'll have to continue to make available as they make updates to the National Spatial Reference System. So metadata is the most important part of any coastal data set, because that allows us all to translate between the various data sets that are coming out. So if you have more interest in that, and in the YK Delta area in particular, maybe just shoot me an email and I can provide those to you.
Great, thank you. I do. I'll send you an email.
All right, thanks for those updates, everyone. It's good to hear all these cool, I don't know, collaborations that are happening right now in this conversation. We're gonna move. Oh, go ahead, Erin.
I was going to say, can I add one thing actually?
Yeah.
So I have a new graduate student actually starting this fall, and I thought I would just put it out there. So he's interested in working with our topobathy LiDAR data, and we're looking to find a partner actually to work with, to look at some sort of specific phenomenon. He's a geological engineer, related to the intersection between the topobathy data and an engineering use. And so if you have a great project that you would like a very talented graduate student to work on with you and ourselves, yeah, feel free to email me. So we're just starting to look at potential opportunities for him. So.
Great, thanks, Erin. Okay, we're gonna have to move on. I'm gonna go quickly through these deliverables on a broad scale so that we can get more to talking about plans and getting some feedback. in the last bit of this meeting. So we have a couple of deliverables that we've identified within the broader plan that we see ourselves contributing towards. So the first group really deal with species and food security on the coast. So looking at seabird mortality events, changes in marine mammals and fishes that are food sources, and then threats from coastal invasive species, biotoxins, and wildlife diseases. Like I said, I'm going to go quickly through these. These are all listed out in the event webpage if you want to read them in more detail. And then we have this deliverable focused on applied models of coastal processes. So looking at the ocean, land, atmosphere interaction with explicit inclusion of decision makers in those models. And then we have a series of deliverables around coastal risk mapping. Create maps of areas that are high risk for coastal erosion, permafrost thaw, and flooding. And then ones around coastal threat identification. So what are the main threats for communities in remote and coastal Alaska, including collecting data on those threats and then modeling and analysis of those threats. And so that was a very brief, very quick overview of our deliverables that we're looking at over the next year. And so now we're gonna talk a bit about our plans. And here's where we're looking for some feedback from you all on how we can incorporate community needs and community driven feedback into our plans. So the first is, we've been referencing this meeting on coastal mapping, coastal erosion. So that's coming up in May. And Tom, did you want to talk more about that?
Sure. So this meeting has, I'm sort of reworking my draft plan, so it's a little different from the one I sent you, but this has 4 goals as I see it. And the first goal is to focus the research community on a set of interrelated objectives in the IARPC Biennial Implementation Plan that Christina just went over. And so when we looked at the plan, it seemed like, okay, there's 3 elements that are interrelated that we might want to focus on first. And I can go over those. Actually, I'll just list them right now. They are priority area 1, objective 1.3, provide research and technical support for water and sanitation infrastructure. And the second element is in priority area 2, objective 2.3, understand interactions between social, ecological, and physical Arctic systems, particularly in the context of coastal climate and cryospheric change. And then also the last element, priority area 4, objective 4.2, update and improve the statewide threat assessment. So those are the 3 elements. There's a total of 5 deliverables that we sort of thought we could sort of focus on in this May 15th meeting. And the second goal of this meeting is to inform the lead agencies of relevant research efforts and to allow researchers to provide updates on their work. So, there's a lot going on in this space, and so we're hopeful that the lead agencies will be able to attend the meeting, and that number of researchers who are doing work in this space would be able to sort of just give really quick updates on their work that they're doing that's relevant to those objectives that are highlighted in the plan. And then the third objective or goal would be to enable the agencies to provide guidance to potential collaborators. Because maybe some part of the deliverable is already covered by some person X, but there's another part of the deliverable that's not yet covered. And so the agencies could basically direct research effort in that where it needs to go, basically. And the final goal is sort of putting it all together to facilitate the development of collaborating teams of researchers in pursuit of specific objectives in the biennial implementation plan.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I don't think we have a link to that meeting yet, but do we have a date?
It's okay. It is May 15th, 11 a.m.
Okay, great. And so once we have a link for that meeting, we'll amend it to the notes of this meeting and then keep an eye out for that meeting invite if you're interested. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through the plans all at once, and then we can discuss. I really want to leave time for discussion. So in terms of the deliverables around species and food security, we're planning a series of meetings on different species and concerns. So there's an upcoming co-meeting with the Marine Ecosystems Group on salmon and coastal systems. That's in 2 weeks. And then we're planning some meetings on harmful algae blooms, kind of spurred by that bloom that they saw in the Bering Strait region this past year. And it would be great if we could particularly talk about the rapid community communication that happens from those researchers out in the field, because that was a really interesting and great component of what they were doing. And then also a meeting on community-based monitoring and how folks are what they're monitoring in their environment, why they're monitoring it, and how they make that fit together. So those are in the works, and we would welcome ideas and input on speakers or groups that we should invite, things like that. And then the last component that we have planned is submitting proposals for conference sessions, particularly around these coastal risk and threats deliverables. We've identified the conferences listed on the right there as targets for trying to have a session. And again, we would welcome input on topics, particularly if you attend these conferences, what you think specific topics you'd like to see covered. And then if there's any meetings that you think we should try to have a presence at beyond these as well. Okay, so in the last few minutes, oh yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so there was a straight science talk on harmful algae and seabirds last week. Great, okay, so we'll keep an eye out for that recording. So in the last few minutes of this meeting, I really want to have some thoughts from you all on how we can be responsive to community input and really integrate community needs under this new plan and these deliverables, and just any input on our plans and how we can incorporate different folks and topics that we may not have thought of yet. So I know we only have a few minutes, but we would welcome some input there, as well as on specific topics that we talked about today. So the erosion meeting and the salmon meeting.
So I can, I would be happy to talk more about the environmentally threatened communities assessment. So I didn't mention that in my intro. but I am about to have funding from the Denali Commission start again, and we'll be hiring an Alaska fellow in this fall, actually, to go back to the original environmentally threatened community assessment. So not the unmet needs component, but the actual assessment itself, and do a bit of a retrospective analysis of it right now. So I worked on the original, that original project on the permafrost team, and then combining some of the threat assessments together. So I'm quite familiar with the data and the process that was used. And so, so this is a kind of an initial, retrospective analysis that it's a good time for it to happen, and to provide some, I would say, key highlights that when we presented the original report, I would say they're not super well highlighted. The focus was originally on the outputs of the report, not how we could make it better next time.
Right.
And so anyway, so that'll be something that I'd be happy to talk more about and be involved with. And then, like I said, I'll have a fellow coming on for 9 months to work on some of this and do a little bit of the data analysis to some of the statistical clustering and analysis that it could have been more robust on the main project. I'll just put it that way. So anyway, so I'd be happy to talk more about that. And yeah, that's in one of my research interests right now. So in areas of focus.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Erin. And I see that overlapping a lot with, I think the priority area that's specifically on hazards.
So Erin, is your work on permafrost, is that sort of going to address the threat assessment needs of the Denali Commission in the area of permafrost, would you say?
So we did it, actually. So I was part of the group that did that original threat assessment.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm very familiar with what data we did, what our process was, what our end results were. It's a good time to start thinking and discussing what the next iteration might look like is a good way to put it. And so I'm happy to see this team addressing it, components of it for sure.
Because I think that is something that we might be talking about in the May meeting, if you're able to join that.
Mm-hmm.
You might be leading it.
Oh, I don't need to lead it. I'm happy to listen and to hear a lot of feedback right now. I think that'll be really helpful. So.
Yeah, it seems like I'm just looking because IARPC sent out a list of the leads, the federal agency points of contact for the different deliverables. And it looks like Dee Williams and Lee Erickson are sort of tasked with being the point people for the deliverables in priority area 4 under objective 4.2, which is a statewide threat assessment work.
Yeah, I'd be curious on your thoughts on this, Erin, just because in finding out that it is a priority to update the statewide threat assessment, my understanding is that there's not much additional data, especially data that is consistent and available across all of our communities that can be utilized to make that sort of update. And so without that additional information, I hate to see additional work go into making an update to the statewide threat assessment. It's like, okay, we had the baseline erosion assessment back in 2009. We're still using those results. And instead of making improvements to them, we're just repackaging them into another report. So I don't want to see another repackaging.
No.
But if you do know of data that's out there that would make improvements, that's great. And I think, Lee and Dee have some things to contribute, but those projects are not statewide and are not consistent across all communities. So hopefully you can come to the meeting in May.
Yeah, no, you had, yeah, I like, that's why I said, if you knew the data that we used in the first place and some of the methods that were used in the first place, and you knew like that they were very qualitative at the time, you can track out like part of my intention in doing this retrospective analysis, and it would have been good if we had done the first time, but there was no money for it, is that there is a lot more data, actually. There is a lot more techniques available is what I'll say. And our compute capacity has increased quite a bit. And so I think to have wall-to-wall coverage, like we envision, that will take another decade, actually. But to have improvements on what's done, I actually know that we can do some of them fairly effectively now, especially if we're thinking about how to do some of the interpolation, actually. And we couldn't do it this year, but we can do quite a bit within the next 3 years, actually. So that's part of my intention in coming back into the space, is to start mapping out what, like how these like efforts coordinate with each other. And yeah, one of the primary issues on that project is that you need relatively complete coverage. And you can have that interface into that quality, or sorry, that qualitative data. Actually, there's some hacking on it, essentially. And then when you do the cluster analysis, there's not actually enough points is the problem between the communities to have really robust statistical analysis. And so there's a number of like issues to address and go over, essentially. Again, we're never really part of that original project. And so that, like I said, that's kind of like my interest, is to start coming in and framing some of these, and not necessarily saying we're going to fix all of them right now, because we're not. But when like there's a lot of efforts and people that want to contribute data, and I appreciate that, but then you have to have a plan to interpolate it. And I think that that's like one of the key things that has been missing, from my opinion, or from my side. And there is definitely a lot more capacity to do that work now than there was. So.
I want to be mindful of the time, and if folks have to log off, thank you so much for coming. And if you want to puzzle on some of this some more and give feedback, we would welcome that. But the meeting is, I'm able to stay on and keep this meeting open for a bit if folks want to keep chatting. Taze is our note keeper. I don't know if he, okay, that sounds good, Jackie. We'll be in touch. Taze, I don't know if you're able to stay on for a few more minutes.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
I'm glad you extended the meeting, Christina, because I had some thoughts that might be relevant, and that is, for the threat assessment, it seems to me we'd want to be concerned about the current threat, but also what's coming in the future, 30, 50, 60 years from now. And to sort of look into the future, really the only viable tools that we have are the global climate models. So it seems like we want to combine observations of permafrost thaw with models of permafrost thaw to sort of get a handle on what's likely to come.
Yeah, Tom, that I was about to say, that's a really key point that a lot of people may not know, is that the current threat assessment is retrospective looking only, actually. And so there's a number of issues to bring up in it, and I think highlight better, that would be like very key, and how that threat assessment was set up versus how a lot of like science and even engineering studies look now are different. And so I think that there's a real opportunity to, like I said, come back in, look at what was done, and then look at like how do we actually incorporate these things that we should be.
Great. Well, hopefully we can have that discussion sometime. But I think that it might just be you, and I'm not sure if the meeting is over.
Well, we left, there's still a few folks here who I don't know if they are waiting to chime in or not, but if they are, they're welcome to. But yeah, I wanted you guys to be able to tie off that conversation.
Well, you know, when I looked at the implementation plan, it does seem like some parts of it do seem to be forward-looking, and maybe the threat assessment itself is just looking backwards. But it seems to me you can't really have a viable threat assessment if you're not looking forward. But I don't know what the charge of the threat assessment is.
I can tell you a little bit of the logic, at least on the permafrost team. And that was because, at least on the permafrost team, we were really looking at impacts to infrastructure. And the theory was, it's not a bad theory actually, is that if there were issues with infrastructure, they're happening right now, and they will continue to happen in the future actually. And so there will be acceleration due to climate change, but and new impacts, but that wasn't terrible logic, is what I'll say, for the permafrost.
Because there's a lot of stuff happening right now, and just understanding what's going on right now is important. Yep. But it's also important, I think, to be looking to the future. Planning, right? And it's certainly, for example, with sea level rise, you know, thaw subsidence of the permafrost lands, you really need to be thinking about the future as far as flooding is concerned, because that threat is, we know it's going to be getting worse and worse in the future. So and when you're making investment decisions for infrastructure, you need to know what the conditions on the ground are going to be like in the coming 30, 50, 100 years, so that those investments make sense, seems to me.
Yeah, this was talked about in the report, like the original like environmentally threatened communities report. But one thing that is definitely an issue in doing the threat assessment is that when you mitigate one threat, permafrost is a great example. The threat, the interface between flooding and permafrost. So often, if you move out of the flood zone where the permafrost is easier to mitigate for, you're going to move into very ice-rich permafrost. So a lot of communities are really preferentially located on floodplains to mitigate that like permafrost component. And so it's a question of which threat do you want to mitigate for, and how do you want your exposure to be. And it can be challenging when you have different parts of community, like housing and infrastructure, having different exposures within the same community. And there isn't like a clear understanding necessarily of the trade-offs between those different threats.
Right.
That's interesting.
Triage.
It's very challenging actually. So yeah, and so that would be like one of my like personal take homes from that project, is that yeah, it's definitely very challenging.
So the condition of the permafrost is really quite different, right, in the floodplains compared to what it is just a little bit inland.
Yeah, the communities in general are preferentially located off any Yedema, which is good. So if possible, but that means that if they want to get off the floodplain, that's what they're going to be moving on to. And that can be like very challenging to deal with. And also from a data standpoint, a lot of the like bigger land classification studies that have been well validated were validated on these much bigger landforms and ecosystem types. And so when you go to then apply them to communities, sometimes it's not as great of a fit as you would hope. And that's because these communities are preferentially located in order to provide better access and actually to either like deliberately or not mitigate for like dealing with some of these other issues. And so it's a pretty, these are good things to know about is what I'll say. So.
Yeah. Well, in Hooper Bay, the people are definitely not living on the floodplain because the floodplain really floods. So they're on the highest land that's available to them in the, you know, proximal to the coast. I'm not 100% sure what the I think it's discontinuous permafrost there. So there is some permafrost thaw impacting infrastructure and that kind of thing happening. Houses are kind of, you know, tilting and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and those are some of the most difficult areas to deal with because you have both threats overlapping with each other, and so one of the easier ways to mitigate either one of those things would be like there's not a lot of bedrock availability either, and so that's like a strategic way to mitigate for some of that. If you like preferentially go towards bedrock and you excavate, and that's not an option there. And so yeah, so there are it's important that like there's a lot of different intersections going on in the communities, and there are a number of communities. And so that was, like I said, one thing that I took away from the study is how do we make sure when we're doing this sort of work that we're capturing relatively well most communities. And that's often the challenge in interfacing between the science and engineering reports that are very, very community focused versus scaling it to these like bigger scale assessments. And like I said, if you just use more of the land classification, like ecosystem approach, there are some issues with that. And so I think that's part of where some of this conversation needs to go to discuss like in a 10-year plan that there are opportunities to go back and better focus some of the existing data actually and add some more quantitative assessments. And if you knew about like where there were some gaps in terms of data, and you have options in your research and the communities are interested, then we can start more actively filling some of these needs as well strategically.
So I see the value in a threat assessment like the one that was done, just to make sure that you know which communities are potentially vulnerable, just so that no one gets left behind. So even if it's somewhat imprecise, at least you're basically, hopefully the most vulnerable communities are sort of floating to the top, so you know who to worry about. My other perspective on this is that for decision makers, we want to somehow bring cost of mitigating these hazards into the mix, because we have a couple hundred communities that are vulnerable to flooding, erosion, permafrost thaw, etc. And it seems to me that we can basically come up with an estimate of the costs to mitigate flooding, erosion, and maybe permafrost thaw for each of these communities, as well as an estimate of what it would be just to relocate the community. And that basically puts all the data in a form that is, it seems to me, a little bit easier for decision makers to sort of figure out what to do with, right? If you see that, oh, this particular community, just because of its circumstances, is going to be spending a lot of money on erosion control, is going to be spending a lot of money on flood control. And at some point you realize, oh, those costs are going to be actually bigger than the cost of relocation. And so then you start thinking, okay, that might be a way to drive decision making if you had actual cost projections to mitigate hazards.
Yeah, these are, this is part of why I wanted to do the retrospective analysis actually, is to talk about some of these things and build on the unmet communities approach that they did. and best understand what are the metrics that people are interested in. How do we go from like a hazard assessment, which there's some fuzziness to it, and there are many ways to do a hazard assessment. And one thing that I've brought up, especially coming from a data science background, that I'm pretty cognizant of, is that making sure that there's still strong like community and decision-making engagement in that assessment process, like the actual prioritization, is really important, because there is a subjective component to it, and those subjective priorities will change over time, and they do bleed into the economic analysis. Actually, it's whether or not you know about it. And so I think some of this will be important to like decouple in creating a slightly better process, actually. So even on the economic side, for example, can you get like perfect information on permafrost degradation and damage? No, you can't, actually. And that's because one of the #1 ways to damage permafrost is convective water flow, actually. And right now, that isn't well coupled to most of the permafrost prediction, actually. And so it's.
I'm sorry, did you say that you said that the one of the big impacts to permafrost is basically floodwaters?
It's not floodwaters, actually. It's drainage.
Groundwater?
Nope, not even groundwater. It's where like watershed from roofs go, and like superficial water transport in general.
Superficial. Okay, yeah.
That's the fastest way to thaw ice-rich permafrost, actually.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. And so it's a huge like damaging factor right now.
Yeah.
And it happens pretty much everywhere, actually. And we see it. You can capture it. Can you model it very well? Not actually as well as you'd hoped. And so that's been an area of like permafrost research for about 10 years. I've been bringing up for a long time. We will be able to do it. But that's why I mentioned that like some of these things coming up with like this short-term plan of like what would be helpful, what can we do within the next like 2 to 3 years if we wanted to repeat this, and what do we ideally want something to look like, so we can all be progressing towards a goal together, looking at some of the metrics like you're talking about. And I feel like that's part of what's been missing from some of these conversations, is we're all like, okay, well, it's important to do this, that's awesome, but we don't really have like a collaborative plan yet. So I think it's a good time to talk about it.
Right. Well, that was one of the objectives that I sort of had originally here, was to sort of get teams together and to discuss methodologies for doing these assessments. Because I think when you have a group of people who are engaged, you end up with a better methodology. Then, because sometimes if just one person, even the best person, they can kind of go astray, right? They're not taking into account everything that they could. They're missing, they got blinders on, that's just human nature. So I think to some extent having a group approach is actually beneficial.
Absolutely. Well, like from the data science side, one of the like main ways to improve the risk assessment that's easy, actually, and will make it more robust, is that even if you're aggregating data at the community level, doing the risk assessment at the building level and at the asset level is really critical, actually. And that's to give us enough statistical power to actually do more analysis on the risk side. And so, yeah, it's kind of, there's a lot of things that can go into this.
Tom, I wonder if and I only know about the things you all are working on from these meetings, basically, but I'm wondering if like a workshop of some sort where you bring in all these folks to talk about methods and improving methods.
Yeah,
that's useful, or if that's already happening.
It's not, actually. Yeah, so that's something that we'll be hosting a workshop next spring as part of our retrospective analysis. But if there's interest in this, I actually have been like I said, I've worked on this enough that I actually think that there's a need for like an NSF RCN on this, actually, because it's huge, actually. And so it's good that this group is going to address it, but there's a need for a consistent working group
right,
going through this, that is part on the data providing side, part on the like community side, part on the like assessment side, unpack some of these things and, like I said, help create like what does a plan look like? Because it is a challenging problem, but there is a report that exists now, and so that's like I said, a really good opportunity to look at what was great. And now the unmet needs has come on and done the economic assessment on top of that, which is great too. What went well with those? And then how do we improve, and like what would a timeline look like? And I think, like I said, from my perspective, there is a lot of opportunity to improve on the data side in ways that other people might not know about. That's part of my background. And then also the statistical like data processing side. Oh, there's huge improvements there. But how do we do that in a way that still respects some of the good parts of the original process? And part of that was that the rankings, because that's what they wanted, were well accepted, and people did feel like overall they represented the system at the time. And so yeah, so I think there's some really good opportunities to have a much a very go in depth into this and really think out some of these things. And again, just from like the technology side, this is a great time to be talking about it in ways that we couldn't do like 4 years ago. It's just compute is so much cheaper. There's so much more data. We can do a lot of extra things now, and this is a really good time to like dream the bigger dreams, is what I'll say, and then allow people in their projects to be able to like link into this effort a lot more effectively. So.
Yeah, it seems like, I'm not sure exactly what you're doing, but it seems like bringing in the climate model data as well and training a risk model with that climate model data would also be useful to sort of just see the trends, get a handle on the trends.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of opportunity, as well, say. Yeah, there's also something that I pointed out is that like some of the big global monitoring programs that are out there now that are coming online, like the SWAT mission, the NASA SWAT mission, they actually like have pretty good data for doing some of this work, to be really honest. And they have these new satellite missions, and right now, like, and that's not the only program. There are some key opportunities to take these big global missions and see how they fit into these efforts. And so, like I said, that's not an immediate like it's going to happen this year. But as we look forward, how do we interface these two different types of data? Some of the like bigger global programs, and then where our in-depth ground measurements need to be made. And my favorite is, how often do they need to be made? Like, how do you actually capture change effectively? And that's been probably one of the major issues that I see also professionally, is that there's been a great emphasis on getting baseline data, and that's awesome. But really, with a lot of these things, we're talking about time issues actually. And so how do we effectively do that? And modeling is one way to do it, but so is strategic repeat measurements actually. So yeah, so there's a lot of parts that go into it. And then like you said, Tom, then there's the future as well. And so that's where like in all of this, when I look at the end, how do you have a good system that then allows ideally a group of people to sit down every 5 years, look at all the data, have it all really cleaned up, and then use their value system at the time to then recreate what they feel like is the most reflective group of rankings for that period, for like that next set period going forward. And so that's, yeah.
Right, and I think in addition to the ranking, it's nice to translate it as best possible to dollars and cents, because ultimately it's a dollars and cents question.
It is and it isn't. So,
well, part of it is because, you know, a lot of the coastal protection that is not really getting done because it's too expensive.
Totally, yeah, but I would always caution that it's like having dollars be the main impact alone. I definitely agree there's value to like it being part of it. But again, if you know that this is like we could have all this data, I could do an unclassified classification, or we could automate a lot of this actually. But do I actually think that that's a good idea? No, I don't actually. And so I think that's the key part, is how do you like fit these metrics in that you know are important, like economics, like you said, like the threats, and then still allow those metrics to represent priorities at the time. And that to me is really key. Yeah.
It just, you know, because when I think about the flooding, you know, it's just going to be such a big deal in lots of Alaska with, you know, just imagine, you know, 6 feet of sea level rise, you know, by the end of the century, which is totally reasonable, right? That just means that the cost of, you know, mitigating flooding is just going to be astronomical. And so you just have to get it on the radar because it's not going away. It's real. And the sooner we start factoring that in, I think the better.
Absolutely. One metric actually that I've suggested adding on to this report that like in terms of like infrastructure money is super critical actually is an energy dimension. And so that's something that we'll also be starting to work on and talk about because when you think about like buildings and infrastructure and where there's a lot of money available actually right now, energy, including heat and like generation capacity is really critical actually. And so anyways, I think there's a real opportunity to like I said, look at what was done, and then see what's missing, what could be added, how would that add value, what does the planning look like, and how do these different coordination efforts like better fit into some of these efforts. And so yeah, hence why I want to do it at the building level actually. So yeah.
Well, super chatting with you about this stuff, and I look forward to more of it.
Totally. Well, thanks everybody for taking a little bit of extra time. Like I said, we're just getting going back on this after a little time, after, like I said, a bunch of years not working on it. I did not work on the unmet needs report. So I really appreciate being able to have that perspective of what they put together. But yeah, but like I said, I'm interested in going forward. Taze, did you have something to add?
No, it was really fascinating to hear you guys go back and forth on things that I'm not specifically engaged with, and you certainly put my fingers to the work. But I hope that I captured all of your comments back and forth. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, no problem. Well, like I said, it's an interesting project. So yeah, I think part of my goal is how do we create space on a lot of dimensions to have these conversations, because as the unmet needs report like shows, this does have very large impacts actually, as to the original report. And so yeah, I'm pretty cognizant of that. And like I said, I've really appreciated like reading that report, being able to see like where they took things, and then yeah, like I said, thinking about coming back to the data component of it. So
yeah, I think there's some other pieces that could be, you know, considered if you're doing like these large scale, because there's a whole aspect of archaeological and cultural pieces that are there that are not even really, you know, at the top end of the price scale for certain places, but for some agencies it's actually super important for them. And so I was kind of like going like, oh my word, like there's a lot that's, you know, still there from that cultural resource, archaeological resource, all that kind of perspective as well. So
yeah, so those were actually considered in the like this first assessment, and yeah. So,
yeah, no, I'm not saying that it wasn't.
Yeah.
It's more that, yeah, it's just another element of dimension that we've gotten, you know, very much into the infrastructure piece of the conversation, and left behind these other pieces. So, you know, when Tom brings up, yeah, we have to have all these different voices in the conversation. Yeah, it's totally true. It's totally true, because there's so many other pieces that are sitting there that, yeah, deserve and merit conversation about, and how to best consider them. And is there new information that might be more helpful to understanding how those might be impacted as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally agree. Hence why I always say like better understanding the process, having more transparency around it, understanding why things may be quantitative and where quantitative is appropriate, where qualitative is appropriate, where that works better to capture some of these like dimensions is really critical. one thing that we looked at actually was trails, actually, because those are a very key transportation mechanism. Were they explicitly discussed in the report or in our original assessment? No, that's another thing that like could be added. So yes, I think hence why I say that like there's the data side and then there's the process side, and understanding how the two things mix together is really, I think redoing it and having a better way to integrate these things would be valuable, actually. So.
Yeah, and there's a cultural side to it. I know we've spent a bunch of effort doing place names, just because place names are really important from a cultural perspective, and so the loss of certain place names has a pretty significant impact in a cultural dynamic picture there too. So anyways, super fascinating. And it was thank you for bringing it up and looking back into some of this, because yeah, there's a lot of important pieces there.
Absolutely. Personally, the place names caused me a lot of issues, actually. So we, because they changed even through the project, actually, and they were, I recommended that they wouldn't be our primary key, but they ended up as our primary key, and so they caused me a lot of problems, actually. So yes, I have a high appreciation of that, like, it is important, actually, and how do you reflect it, and how do you make the materials reflected appropriately as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for being so engaged, and thanks everyone for staying on. Really appreciate it. Aaron, I hope that you continue to come join and update us on what you're doing, and yeah, we'll further the dialogue.
Awesome. Yeah, I will attend as frequently as I can, and I'll try to make this more of a priority. So thanks for inviting me. And then, like I said, you'll definitely have my fellow coming.
Great.
For 9 months for sure. So that'll be great. So yeah, and I'd be happy to talk more. So.
Erin, I think earlier in the conversation you mentioned that you have this new data set, like a coastal data set, right? I think it was like Bathy Topo near the coast. Is that right?
Oh yeah. Well, and we're still collecting.
I gotta go, so I'm gonna let you guys talk about that.